Good afternoon. I'm Joyce Barrett. Welcome to today's webinar. Webinars are brought to you through the generosity of Heritage Ohio supporters. We invite you to join us by visiting the Heritage Ohio website. Heritage Ohio's mission is helping people to save the places that matter, build community, live better. Today's presentation is on the legal compliance for nonprofits in Ohio. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. If you have a question, please type it into the question box at any time. Later this afternoon, you will receive an email from GoToWebinar with a link to the recording of this webinar, which you're welcome to share. We also post our webinars on the Heritage Ohio YouTube channel the next day, so you'll see that tomorrow if you need to share it with anyone. Please notice in the control panel, Beth has provided us with a copy of this PowerPoint. So you can download it there, or you can write me at jbarrett@heritageohio.org and I'll send it to you. Today's speaker is Beth Short, who handles outreach and education for the Ohio Attorney General's Charitable Law Section. Beth is a graduate of the Ohio State University. And with that, Beth, I'm going to have you take the presentation over.
Thank you for this opportunity, and let me give you all right at the beginning, so I don't forget towards the end, my email address in case you want to reach out later. It's Beth, BETH.short, SHORT, at ohioago.gov. And Joyce also has my contact information, and while we can't provide you with legal information, legal advice rather, we provide legal advice to one person, and that's the Attorney General Dave Yost, but we can try to point you in the right direction if something comes up. Also, I love going on the road doing board governance training. If you'd be interested in hosting a training in your community for other charities that you might be working with, let me know and we'll see if we can work something out. I think that's the housekeeping stuff I wanted to cover before we get started. So please feel free, and Joyce can interrupt me as we go. I want to make sure that we provide the most useful information that you need. So we call this training Minding the Business While Changing the World, because many times people get involved with boards because not because they want to go to another meeting every month, but because they have a real passion for the cause, the programming, something going on, and they don't take time to step back a bit and think about whether they're living up to their legal obligations, because there are significant responsibilities that board members and leaders of charities have, and if they don't take care of minding those kinds of requirements and treating it like the business that it needs to be treated as, it can really jeopardize the long-term viability of the organization. So one of my goals is try to put tools into people's hands that help good people do good things the right way. And we're the regulators in the state of Ohio of the charitable sector. And let me assure you that everyone in our office knows that it takes a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to make things work the right way within our charitable sector. And we are appreciative of the efforts of Ohioans who step forward to make a difference in their communities in volunteer and staffing and funding. All the stuff that goes into making things work right, and it elevates the quality of life that we all actually take for granted many times. So I want you all to understand that we say thank you. Thanks for what you're doing. So I mentioned that I find it really important. We want to help people do things that have good intentions, who are trying to do it the right way. We want to put tools in their hands to help them do that thing properly. I'd like to suggest that you take a look at our webpage at charitable.ohioago.gov, and we have tried to put online a number of tools that we hope help people. We have recorded versions of board governance training, one on the charitable registration system. We have a number of webinars on a variety of topics. We have a nonprofit newsletter you can subscribe to, but I do want to call your attention to two publications that I think every board member should take a look at least once a year, and that's the Guide for Charity Board Members and the Avoiding Theft Those two are available online virtually, and it can really try to focus your thinking about making sure that you are covering the important parts of minding the business of your organization. Well, many people are surprised to learn that the AG's office is involved in the life of charities, but it's actually our oldest responsibility, and it goes back to jolly old England centuries ago, and people would leave behind funds to help the orphans in a village sometimes. But sometimes the trustees indeed help the orphans in the village, and sometimes the trustees help themselves instead. And so in 1601, they developed the Statute of Charitable Uses. It says the Attorney General shall have the authority to stand in the shoes of beneficiaries and force trustees to do the right thing. And so every day in our office, we're doing work on behalf of senior citizens, children with cancer, veterans, or whoever the beneficiaries are intended to be for every single charity that's out there operating. And that's a very cool thing to get up every day in the morning to work towards. When we talk about Ohio's charitable sector, we're talking about a gigantic, diverse community of all kinds of groups doing all kinds of great things. They may be multi-million-dollar organizations with even thousands of employees, or they may be very small grassroots groups. Like think about grandmothers who might form a reading club in a local park. They're going to have no employees, they're going to have no assets, precious few resources. But wherever you are on that continuum in terms of complexity of organizations, if you're on the board, you have the exact same identical legal duties when you're involved in the charitable sector. I'm going to quickly run through what I call the lineup information of charities. And if you're involved with one or more charities, if you're on the board, you ought to know the lineup information for your organization, and you ought to check on it every year. It will take you about 11 minutes to complete what I think should be an annual checkup. But let me quickly illustrate what I'm talking about by pretending that someone has built a new high school somewhere and they're going to need athletic booster group. And so their first step is going to be going to the Ohio Secretary of State's office, and they're going to incorporate as a nonprofit organization. Assuming no one else makes the use of the name Anywhere High School Booster Group and the paperwork has been completed properly, the Ohio Secretary of State, which handles filings for every entity doing business in Ohio, is going to say, congratulations, here are articles of incorporation for your nonprofit. Every 5 years, you have to file a continued existence statement with the Ohio Secretary of State to tell them that you are still in business and to keep saving that name and not let anyone else use it. So every year, it's very difficult to remember when the 5th year is. Every board member ought to go to the Secretary of State's office, go to their business filing search, type in the name of your entity, and see what it says about your group. Check, it'll say what year that filing is due. And if you check every year, you won't miss it. The other thing you should check when you're in there is who is your statutory agent. And the statutory agent is kind of the official mailbox for accepting correspondence for your entity. So many times we have groups that say, oh my goodness, I just noticed it says Mrs. Smith and she died 8 years ago. So if you're a board member, every year at the beginning of the program year, go into the Secretary of State's office, look up your group, see what it says, make sure the statutory agent that they list is still timely contact, and see what year that filing is due. The next step Anywhere boosters are going to take is going to the IRS. And I'm guessing all of you have already done that, and you have an EIN, a Federal Employee Identification Number. And that's kind of a unique identifier like a Social Security number that follows an entity throughout its life. That will take you only a few minutes to get this EIN. The next step takes more effort, and that is asking the IRS to be treated as a tax-exempt entity. Now, there are lots of different types of tax-exempt entities, and I'm told that many of you are 501c3s, you may be a C6, but the IRS wants to hear from the Anywhere booster groups what that organization is going to accomplish. Now, there are different types of tax exempt statuses. For instance, the Chamber of Commerce is tax exempt. Homeowners associations are tax exempt. Chambers of Commerce, the Elks Club, credit unions. But what we're talking about for the boosters group is a 501c3, and those are the only tax exempt groups that can accept tax deductible contributions. And the IRS is going to want to hear from us in our application process for that, how we are going to benefit a broad community of undefined beneficiaries. So I may want to set up a group to give scholarships to my family members. That'd be a very nice thing to do, but that would not qualify as a tax exempt purpose as a 501c3. They want to know that it's going not to just people I have a close association with, but to a broader community. So we're going to have to explain to them that the activities of Anywhere Boosters is going to help all the students of Anywhere School enhance their educational experience through athletic endeavors. So assuming the IRS decides, yes, indeed, we're going to make you a 501c3, there are certain expectations the IRS has of all 501c3s, and one of those includes filing an annual 990. If you fail to file it in 3 years, you automatically lose your tax exempt status. So if you're on the board of an organization, every year go into irs.gov. There is a page there to search for 501c3s. Type in the EIN or name of your group, and hopefully up pops a box saying, yes, indeed, this organization qualifies for tax deductible contributions. If it says anything other than that, you need to clear up that problem right away. But that will take you about 3 minutes. And then if you're an Ohio charity or a charity soliciting Ohioans, you need to be doing an annual filing with my office. And I'll show you in a moment what that page looks like so that you can go in and double check to make sure it says your organization is in compliance with the filing responsibilities you have on a state basis. I'm going to mention here briefly, because I know a number of people might be on the borders of other states. Most states in the union have some sort of registration requirement like this. The most common model is like Ohio's, where it's done through the Attorney General's office. Sometimes charitable registration is a separate activity within the Secretary of State's office. In the state of Florida, it's in the Department of Agriculture. So if you are providing programs in or fundraising in other states, you need to check to see what their expectations are for your organization. These 2 steps that I mentioned involving the IRS and our office, there's a big category of organization that is exempted from, one, asking the IRS to be treated as a 501c3 and filing annual 990s, and making filings annually with my office, and that is exclusively religious organizations. So if you're a church, temple, synagogue, mosque, you do not have to make those annual filings that the Anywhere Boosters and other charitable organizations have to make each year. Unfortunately, we run into these heartaches far too often. This is a heartbreaking situation when it happens to an organization that you're involved with. These situations aren't created by strangers off the street. It is someone that you know well, probably a friend, a fellow volunteer. So you have this sense of personal betrayal and hurt when you're on the board and this has happened. You may have a sense of embarrassment that this happened on your watch. There's often a loss of funds that can never be recovered. So there can be a real financial crimp. There can be, some damage to the reputation of your organization within the community. And so you want to make sure that you have engaged in developing policies and procedures that protect your organization from this kind of heartbreak. The number one job of board members is to develop policies that protect your organization. And sadly, what we discover in many of these situations is a board that has been asleep at the wheel. The most common formula that we see is that people have a well-liked financial treasurer who handles all the financial activities and operations for the organization. Someone who is well trusted and often a very loyal volunteer. But it is foolhardy to make guesses about who is trustworthy and who might be or might not be trustworthy in the future. Because all across Ohio, we have families that go through situations involving substance abuse issues, mental health issues, gambling addictions, financial challenges involving a family member, medical expenses. These are the things that happen behind closed doors of families all over Ohio, and we never know what's going on. So instead of guessing about these sorts of things and what might happen, you've got to have policies that ensure you have multiple people involved in the financial operations of your organization. With online banking, it is easier than ever before to have multiple people actively engaged. So for instance, I became the treasurer at my church. I didn't want to make any mistakes that would hurt the church. I'd rather make a mistake in my personal checking account than do something to hurt the church. I also didn't want people ever second guessing things like, oh, how did Beth and John manage to get such a nice new car? Well, she is the treasurer. So we spent time developing processes and procedures. What does it look like when you're doing a responsible job of handling the financial operations of your organization? So we decided that every month I would create a certain report with certain types of information that would go to our governing body, our Council of Delegates. But before it went to the Council of Delegates, it was going to be reviewed by 2 of 5 people who had access to our online financial information. They would go in and double check the accuracy of my reports. They would make sure that my reports were complete, that there were not missing transactions or unexplained transfers from the church account into some other bank account. Was everything there like I reported? And if I made a mistake, I certainly wanted people to catch it. Those kinds of policies are what you have to have operating in charitable organizations, because involving, one person can get away with violating standard processes, but when you have multiple people involved, it becomes far more difficult. And so these kinds of policies are what you're required to do when you're a leader of a charitable organization. They protect the charity. They protect the people doing these jobs. And so I never felt as if it was my total responsibility. There were lots of people invested in the activity of making sure we had safe and sound financial operations in place. And then even more importantly, like the prior practice at my church was once you were elected treasurer, the only way to get out of it was to move out of state or die. But there have been multiple treasurers in place at my church since we developed these systems. And so it helps with continuity when someone has taken time to sit down, work out some processes that make sense. They don't have to start from scratch. And so you're just continually updating and refining your policies and practices, as your activities change. So there's a lot more online activities going on these days in the charitable world. Maybe using PayPal, those should be treated just like bank accounts. Any of those types of things where assets are being exchanged, you need to have multiple people involved to make sure that all of the charity's assets are going to be able to be used for its operations, that someone's not helping themselves. It made me feel far more secure in doing this role. I mentioned at the beginning to take a look at that avoiding theft publication that's on our website, but these are things that you got to constantly revisit, and it's what your job as a board member is to make sure that we have those things. It only takes marginally more time to do things the right way than to take a lot of shortcuts that can really jeopardize your organization. And doing it the right way provides everyone with an ability to get a better sleep at night instead of worrying about those things. So please make sure, and I think we probably have a lot of business people on, this is just common good sense that you have to use in making decisions. So what do? We get complaints from people across the community and state every day who may have concerns about what's going on within a charity. We have a staff of compliance examiners, accountants, investigators, lawyers, and we take every complaint seriously. We license bingo, and I mention that because sometimes we get a complaint that says they were not nice to me last Tuesday night at bingo. That complaint will get a whole different level of attention than someone that says, I'm on the board of an organization. I have for months asked the executive director and treasurer for a financial report, and they refuse to provide financial information to the board. Well, that's going to be a huge red flag for us. So we have the authority to do investigations, and we may find that there's absolutely no validity to what was alleged in the complaint, and we are happy to close it and move on. We also may find that while there's no proof to the allegation, we might have discovered an organization that doesn't have its board governance practices up to par with what they should have. So we'll provide some technical support to help them get to where they should be operationally so they can operate in the future more safely. Sometimes we have to file suit, and we'll file suit to maybe kick some people off of a board, or to recover monies that have been misspent, or even to close down a charity that seems more interested in taking advantage of the generosity of others than pursuing some charitable mission. And sometimes we work with local law enforcement when there are criminal prosecutions involved. So the results of a complaint that's filed in our office, it can take many different paths depending on what we find. Now, I mentioned that there is a filing responsibility for all Ohio charities and anyone who's raising funds for a charitable purpose in Ohio. So this is an online system. We suggest that at least 3 people with every organization open a personal account in our online system, and you can connect yourself to 1 or more charities. And when you're connected to a specific charity, you're going to get email reminders from us about when filings are due. You're also going to get copies of anything that's filed on behalf of that charity. So you'll see exactly what someone filed in their annual filing with our office. And if you think it's problematic and fraudulent, you should let us know. So here is, we have a web page, and it's called Research Charities. And if you go in there, you can type the name of an EIN or a organization name, and hopefully they show up in our database. And so here's an old filing for an organization, and let me show you what members of the public get when they type in the name of your organization. They'll get some basic demographic information. This is the part that I think every board member should check annually, making sure it says, yes, your organization's registration status is current. If it says no, and you have an account in our system, you can go to a to-do page that tells you exactly what is missing. And then we'll also provide some basic financial information that's provided in the filing with us. I'm going to run through some provisions of law that you should be a bit aware of, certainly not an expert in, but the big one we have is the Ohio Charitable Trust Act, and it's what gives us authority to do investigations, to take enforcement actions. It creates the registration and reporting requirements for all charitable trusts in Ohio. Some people say, I'm not a charitable trust. I had nothing to do with a probate case, but it's defined really broadly. So any entity that is holding assets that are going to be used for charitable, religious, or educational purpose is a charitable trust. Clearly, all 501c3s are charitable trusts. It is not dependent upon whether you've incorporated in the state of Ohio as a nonprofit. You don't have to have incorporated. You don't even have to have tax exempt status to fall under the definition of a charitable trust. So anyone out there raising funds for what sounds like a charitable purpose, and people have, given funds in good faith that something good is going to come from them, may need to do an annual filing with our office. The issue is not that we have some people out there who think they can fly under the radar by not making any of these filings and not honoring their fiduciary duties to how they use that charitable investment. And so if you walk like a duck and talk like a duck, we're going to hold you to your responsibilities and prevent fraud. So that's 109. The Solicitations Act at 1716 applies anytime there's an appeal to the public to raise funds to support a charitable purpose of some sort. So a charitable appeal, it can be in person, it can be in writing, it can be just orally, door to door, collecting money on the streets. It could be a benefit concert, a spaghetti dinner, running a concession stand at a community festival where the funds are to support a local scholarship funds. Those are all charitable solicitations. And the most important thing to remember under 1716 is, and this should be common sense for everyone, but unfortunately it's not, you're not allowed to lie to raise money. So if you raise money for a local scholarship program, by golly, that's what you need to spend those resources for. This statute also applies to the activities of professional solicitors who are hired by charities to raise funds on their behalf in the state. Think telemarketing, direct mail. They have to be registered with our office annually. They have to be bonded. They also have to file details about every campaign in terms of how much is being collected and how much is being forwarded to the charity. So their activities are governed under 1716. The nonprofit corporation law at 1702. Boy, I used to make fun of this and I'd tell everyone it's great bedtime reading. It outlines a number of provisions about how we expect nonprofits in Ohio to operate. For instance, it says things like you have to have at least 3 board members. This became critically important during COVID because 1702 says that boards are free to use teleconferencing, Zoom, all these platforms that we've become very accustomed to using in the last 2 years. It says boards can use these tools for board meetings, assuming it's not prohibited in their bylaws. That helped organizations continue to take care of governance issues during our coronavirus emergency. Other states didn't have that language, and so their legislative bodies had to quickly create something to allow the good governance to go forward in their state. So if you run into something where your bylaws might not address it, take a look at 1702 and see if there's some default language that might be helpful. And then I mentioned earlier that we license bingo. Bingo, it includes the traditional game we grew up playing in kindergarten with B4, B9, but it also includes the sale of instant bingo tickets. Many of them look a lot like lottery tickets, and you kind of snap open the back of them and it will tell you if you've won anything or not. Bingo, whether it's purse bingo, whether it occurs just one time a year or if it occurs every week, requires a license. And we do trainings around the state called Bingo School, trying to help people and new people to organizations understand the absolute importance of good record keeping. Often bingo's an all cash business, and sometimes sticky fingers walk away with the money that should be used by the charities instead. So we want to make sure people have good practices in place. We get calls every day about raffles, and 501c3s and other specifically named tax exempt entities are permitted to have raffles. However, if I wanted to raffle off my husband's antique motorcycle to support cancer research, that would be an illegal raffle. However, if I went to the Stephanie Spielman Breast Cancer Center at the OSU James Hospital and said, I'm interested in supporting cancer research and was thinking that this raffle of an antique motorcycle could be helpful, and they decide to run a raffle in that manner, they're overseeing all the details. That is a legal raffle. So companies, businesses, individuals are prohibited from holding raffles. Only charitable organizations are permitted to have them. You may have heard of groups having casino nights, that sort of activity to raise funds. But there are very specific requirements in 2915 about the details of those kinds of activities. What kinds of groups are permitted to do them? You can never have them at a hotel or a restaurant, for instance. It can only be held at a facility owned by the charity or leased from a government or veteran organization. While you're there, you can never ever play craps or roulette. Something really horrible must happen with those games, I don't know, but it's specifically prohibited in the statute. And so if you're going to engage in those kinds of activities, take a look at 2915 to make sure you're doing it the right way. Now, I will mention that the Charitable Law Section, we're not the police on this issue. We don't have any criminal authority, but it's important to realize that all of these activities fall in 2915, which is Ohio's criminal code, and it deals with gambling. And so local law enforcement can prosecute cases dealing with these types of fundraising activities if done improperly. And that's not the Charitable Law Section making those calls. So check out 2915 and make sure you're doing those activities the proper way. Now, I mentioned whether you're big or little, you have the exact same obligations as a board member, and we talk about those in 4 different ways, and we'll run through what it looks like to do a responsible job in those areas. We don't think that everybody on boards needs to be a CPA or a lawyer or a financial guru. Regular Joe and Sue Schmo make wonderful board members. But what we do expect of them is that they conduct themselves with the level of care, skill, and diligence that an ordinarily prudent person would use in how they handle their family affairs, for instance. So if you wouldn't cash out your paycheck on Friday and put the money in a paper bag and leave it overnight on your porch for your son to pick up before early Saturday morning, don't do that with the Booster Club's concession stand money from the Friday night football game. If you wouldn't treat your own money that way, don't treat the charity's money that way. So what might it look like when you're living up to your duty of care? Well, if you're on the board, you're going to go to board meetings. You may be getting materials in advance of the board meeting, and that's so you can familiarize yourself with the business that's going to be discussed. Look at it, read it. One of the things that is a pet peeve of mine is going to a board meeting where people read aloud from a written committee report that I've already read at home. So if board members come having done their homework in advance, you can make the highest and best use of people's time when they're all around the table together. Instead of being informed that there's going to be a bake sale on the and a big special event on the first weekend in May, spend time instead brainstorming about how it can be promoted better. What ideas do people have for engaging the community in a bigger way, instead of just reading what they could read on their own. You need to actively participate when you're on the board. When you have questions, you need to answer them, get answers to them. You are individually responsible for every vote that you cast. And so you're responsible for what you do and what you fail to do. And sometimes boards have bullies on a board where, you know, their biggest importance is to see how quickly they can get out of the room. Well, that's too bad, because that person's vote only counts the same amount that mine does. So I need to make sure that every time I'm voting on something, I know it's in the best interest of the organization. Maybe I've even gotten information prior to the meeting when I got advanced materials and I had questions about what something meant on a financial report. In fact, some groups have little mini meetings before the board meeting to review the financial documents to clear up any questions that might come up. But you're responsible to make sure every time you vote, you're not just rubber stamping someone else, but you know what's going on. Now, I will throw in the caveat that, you can't just be a jerk. It requires, some mutual respect and shared expectations around people around the table. But, keeping your eyes on the prize about why are we all doing this in the first place can be helpful. Job number one of board members, establishing policies, and particularly important is financial controls. And then if you have staff members, the board is going to be involved in hiring and firing the executive director and maybe other key staff folks. So sometimes we encounter an organization where the players are upside down. We have an executive director maybe who founded the organization and starts to think that he or she owns the organization. And just to clarify, nobody owns a charitable organization. The community owns it. It's a charitable trust, a community trust. And so we have board members that are sometimes being fired by executive directors. And we need to work to get that situation righted in the proper way. We've talked about the absolute importance of financial controls. We're going to talk about conflict of interest. Maybe you have special policies about major expenditures. So, a major expenditure for the Cleveland Clinic Foundation is going to be a lot different than a major expenditure for the food pantry that I was on the board for. So maybe you have a policy that any purchase over $2,500, you have to have at least 3 vendor quotes, just so that you make sure that the organization is getting the most cost-effective results. You can have policies on spending and investments. If you're lucky enough to have funds that are reserve funds, the board can decide how you want to invest them. What level of risk are you willing to assume on those? Do you want to invest them in Bitcoin, which you shouldn't, but you can make decisions about that sort of thing. You can have gift acceptance policies that say, we just don't have the capacity internally to handle the gift of used automobiles. There's a lot of filing and paperwork that goes with that. And so you're just not going to accept those. Maybe you're with a substance abuse organization and you say, we're not going to accept gifts from the liquor industry. They're the ones that got our clients to where they are. So we're not going to accept gifts from them. Or you may decide the problem is big and we will accept gifts from wherever they come. Perfectly fine. These are things that boards can discuss and decide what's right for them. There will come time when a board may need to hire a certain professional. You need some expertise in a certain area. Maybe you need to hire a lawyer to advise you on something that's new and unique, and there might be various risks and benefits depending on how you maneuver. Perfectly fine. Maybe you need to hire a CPA to come in and evaluate your internal controls. You may think that there's some loss going on. You can't pinpoint how it's happening. Maybe they come in, take a look at your internal controls and give you suggestions for revamping your policies. Maybe the Anywhere boosters decide they want to build a set of bleachers for the marching band at the football field. Rather than mom and dad just coming with their hammers on a random Saturday, you say, you know what, we may want to hire a construction manager for this because we want to make sure that we have a safe structure, that we don't have people injured if it collapses. So we're going to hire someone to oversee and manage this project for us. These are the kinds of things that boards should be discussing and making decisions about. You can have policies about your meetings, where they're going to be. Are you going to invite other people? Are you going to take comments from the public? How many committees are you going to have? How are they going to meet? And I want to mention that under Sarbanes-Oxley, which was developed about 20 years ago, I think we're nearing an anniversary, and it was developed primarily to respond to fraudulent practices in publicly traded companies. But there are 2 provisions that apply to charities. And one is it's impermissible to take retaliatory action against a whistleblower who is sharing information about fraud going on in your organization. And in fact, if you have a significant size organization with multiple employees, you're going to want to think through what kind of whistleblower policy you might want in your organization. So how do you live up to your duty of care? Well, you're just going to have to pay attention and ask questions. Duty of loyalty. We wear lots of hats in our lives anymore because of the busyness that Ohio families have. And when we talk about charities, what we have to be sure of is that when you're sitting at the board and you're making decisions for this charity, that you can never be thinking about how you use this position to generate additional business for your company, or how to elevate your standing in the community, or how to do favors for your friends. It can only be what is in the best interest of the organization. And so we often deal with this through conflict of interest policies. If you Google conflict of interest policies online, there will be no end to the number of examples. The IRS has a couple of them for your consideration, but often it includes a disclosure form that is distributed to the board and key employees, and it's going to gather information about where people in your household work, maybe other boards that you serve on. Are there other ways that your personal life may intersect with the ongoing business operations of the charity? And so when those situations come up in a board context, what we want people to do is say, excuse me, but I want to talk about this because I may have a conflict of interest on this issue. So let's talk about the Anywhere Booster Group. Let's assume that I'm on the board and I own Beth's Builders. So indeed, they've decided they're going to send out a request for proposals to all the local construction firms. It may well be that Beth's Builders has provided a proposal in response to that RFP. So when the issue comes up to select who gets the contract, I'm going to say, I have a conflict of interest on this issue and I'm going to leave the room. I need to leave the room because I want all the remaining board members who don't have a dog in that race and that interest in the outcome of it, I want them to be able to have a very candid discussion about the pros and cons of every proposal that has been provided. I don't want anyone to feel as if I am giving them the evil eye and making them feel uncomfortable if they don't select Beth's Builders. If someone has concerns with the way I do business, they would be free to bring it up. And so the important thing is making sure that the minutes show that I left the meeting for that agenda item, because conflict of interest issues don't come up the next week. They come up months down the line. So instead of recreating from memory whether I left or not, get it in the minutes and there's never a doubt about it. So the remaining board members without a vested interest in the outcome take a look at all the proposals, and it may well be that Beth's Builders is always supportive of local athletics. My proposal is far better than any of the others that have been provided. It's just for cost of goods. People agree that, I have a great reputation for being a sound business in the community, and they vote to award the contract to Beth's Builders. It's not until that vote is taken that I come back into the room. So the issue isn't that a conflict has arisen, because it's going to happen. Unless you have people on your board who live under rocks, which aren't the kind of people that generally serve on boards, there will be conflicts of interest that arise. That's not the issue. What we want to see is an environment in which boards are just talking about it and then responding when those situations arise. The next duty we talk about should be a no-brainer: duty to maintain accounts. We absolutely expect organizations to be keeping records about funds that come in, funds that go out. We expect them to be soundly protected. We expect the board to review reports so that they can raise questions about any issues that develop. You need to develop your budgets and then monitor them, because sometimes you have to make changes to what your projections were. So I guarantee you that in the school-related groups that we have throughout the state, many of them plan a membership campaign in the fall to raise funds, and then maybe a spring gala or spring festival. Well, when coronavirus popped up, we didn't have gatherings, and so they had to cancel those fundraising activities, which means that a big chunk of money that they were planning to spend in some way wasn't going to come through the door. So they had to make adjustments. So what do? You either have to make adjustments on by finding an additional way to raise funds, or you have to cut expenses, and you may not be able to provide all the programs that you had hoped that you would be able to provide to the public. And so boards have to make these kinds of decisions throughout the year. The other thing that you should be looking for are when questions arise. Yeah, so if your utility costs show that they're a lot more than what you projected in your budget, maybe that's a reason to ask questions. Maybe you need to respond by getting a different provider. Maybe everyone says, we had a horrible winter and everyone's utility costs went up, so this isn't out of line with what anyone else is experiencing. Or maybe that's how someone is doing harm to your organization by hiding funds that they're stealing from you and marking them as a utility expense. So you've got to ask questions. Think about how we monitor our own family expenses. So if I get my credit card statement at the end of the month and it says there was $250 worth of fun activities that I charged, but I never got to have the fun, I'm going to be making a call to my credit card company and telling them that I've been improperly billed. So this also gives me another chance to reemphasize the absolute critical nature of the internal controls and checks and balances and having multiple people involved in your financial operations. So we absolutely expect there to be accurate records being kept of your financial activities. I'm going to mention records retention policies. There are, depending on what kind of organization you are, what kind of activities you're engaged in, there will be different expectations for how long to keep certain documents. The Ohio Historical Society, for instance, has some great guidance for public entities on records retention issues. When I became treasurer at my church, we had canceled checks from 1980. Clearly, we didn't need to be keeping canceled checks from that long ago. Some records you're going to want to keep permanently, and my suggestion is to Google and find out what some of the best practices are, or talk to your lawyer or accountant about what they suggest for your unique situation. And this gives me another chance to also mention that charities have a whole lot of personal data that those who are involved in cyber crimes would love to have. We often have employee personal data, volunteer personal data, client data, and donor data, and none of us want that kind of information to fall into the wrong hands. So be sure you know what kind of information you're keeping with your organization and that you are abiding by sound policies for how you're protecting that information. We do have a publication online, Cybersecurity Issues for Small Businesses and Charities, that might be helpful. So it's a sad thing, but we all have to think about cybersecurity issues as it applies to our work lives, our family lives, and our charitable lives. And then the final duty I'm going to mention is the duty of compliance. It is the board's duty to make sure that you're living up to a number of obligations that your organization likely has. We've talked a little bit about some of your federal and state requirements. But governing documents, if you have bylaws that say that every March the Booster Club is going to appoint a nominating committee to present a slate of officers to be elected at an April general membership meeting, then by golly, that needs to be on the planning calendar. You've got to live up to what your governing documents say, and you may call them bylaws, code of regulations, constitution. You can call them a number of different things, but this is how you have explained to the public that your organization is going to operate. You can change and update your bylaws, but until you do, you are legally bound to live up to those procedures that are laid out in those documents. You may well have other contracts that you have to abide by or agreements you have with various parties. And you also must live up to the representations that you make in your solicitations. So if you're going to raise money to build the bleachers at the football field, then by golly, that's what you've got to do with those monies instead of building a cat shelter instead. Many of your groups may be lucky to receive some restricted gifts maybe. Sometimes they're large gifts from a donor who says, I'll donate $1 million to be spent, the earnings to be spent each year on local scholarships for people studying economic development. Well, don't accept a gift with strings unless you are comfortable committing your organization to the legal obligation that comes with using those as promised. So when you accept a gift with restrictions, that is absolutely a legal obligation you have to live up to. Now, sometimes there are gifts that, for instance, someone may leave a university, $1 million to be spent exclusively on research to develop a vaccine against polio. Well, we already have that, so it may become impractical or impossible to live up to the elements that are in a restricted gift. There is a process that uses my office and often a probate court to find the next best use of a gift. So trying to decide what the donor would have intended given this change in circumstances where it's impossible to live up to that obligation. So whether you're raising money for the bleachers or you get a restricted gift that you've made a promise, these are obligations that fall under your duty of compliance. Under federal law, well, you gotta comply with the IRS regulations. So they expect you to abide by all of these types of board governance practices. They expect you to file their annual return. They also expect you to follow those federal obligations about whistleblowers. And there's one other provision under Sarbanes-Oxley that applies to charities, which is to, if you're under federal investigation, which I hope none of you are, you can't just start destroying documents. This is an election year, and I will mention that the IRS, and they have, I think, really good, helpful materials on their web page. Charities are not permitted to participate in what I call R&D politics. That means endorsing a particular candidate, making contributions to a candidate's campaign, creating opportunities to highlight one particular candidate over another. So being free of attaching yourself to those kinds of things are critical. And you can lose your tax exempt status from the IRS if you fail to abide by those. Now that kind of R&D politics is a lot different, however, than being a resource to policymakers when things come up. So if City Council is thinking about redoing the ordinances connected with domestic violence, the local domestic violence shelter may be a great resource to them and provide feedback on what any changes, what the expected outcomes might be from any changes. That's a whole different level of being involved in the political sphere than what the IRS intends for, again, that what I refer to Republican, Democrat, R&D kind of politics that involves specific candidates. Check out their webpage if you have questions, because they give a number of good examples. Under state law, mentioned the requirement to file with my office annually. And by the way, the filings with our office are due the same day as your 990. We honor all IRS extensions, but Sometimes it's helpful for people to think about our income taxes and how we file a state and a federal return. So when you get your 990 done, file both with the IRS and our office. We've mentioned the ongoing connection you're going to have with the Secretary of State's office. And then depending on the various activities of your organization, there may well be other regulations that apply. So if you're engaged in providing healthcare related activities, well, the board's going to want to make sure that there are policies and practices that honor the HIPAA requirements that may apply to your organization. If Anywhere Boosters is going to be staffing a concession stand at the grandstand at football games, there may well be various health department regulations that apply. And so it's up to the board to make sure that there's a pathway forward where the organization does comply with its various obligations. So, you know, what I hope that you can conclude from these things is that it's common sense. We're not trying to make it difficult for folks to step forward and provide leadership in their communities in the way that, you know, really builds stronger communities. I'm gonna stop right here. I will mention that if you do pull down the PowerPoint, there's additional slides after this one that provide some references to resources that I think are helpful. And I'm going to throw it to Joyce. And did we have any questions that came up of things I didn't address, Joyce?
Yes, thank you so much, Beth. We have a couple of questions in the box. The first one is, do nonprofit organizations have to hold an annual meeting of their membership?
That is covered in 1702. So what is an annual meeting? It can look different to different types of organizations. So I'm gonna cop out and tell you to look at 1702 because it specifically mentions that. And you know what, that's a good question that I may develop a frequently asked question on for our webpage.
Okay, the next question, do bylaws have to state the size of your board, minimum or maximum numbers?
Wow, you guys have a lot of 1702 questions. I don't believe that 1702 requires that. It's generally a good idea. I'm trying to think in my mind what that page looks like where it talks about you have to have at least 3 board members. I don't believe that there's language that requires that to be included in the bylaws.
Okay, next question. How specific should your bylaws be about policies and procedures, or do you recommend that the bylaws remain as basic as possible?
I think basic can be good. I think policies don't need to be embedded in your bylaws because there's often special requirements. It's often more difficult to change your bylaws. So if you're a membership group, it may require, you know, the vote of the entire membership to change your bylaws. That's the case at my church, for instance. And policies are those kinds of things that are often operational in nature, and you want to be able to quickly change. You know, if you change your banking practices, you may want to develop and approve policies that reflect new ways that you're handling your financial stuff. So you don't have to embed all of that in your bylaws. There may well be some things that you think speak to the nature of your organization, like you may want to say we have an EEO policy for equal employment and diversity things. You know, you can, if you think that's really fundamental to who you are as a group, you can embed some of those as appendixes or something like that. But you can change it far more quickly generally without having it in your bylaws.
Okay, another question that I want to ask. We were chatting just before the webinar started. As this is an election year, many of our participants are in Main Street groups, which have sponsorship opportunities. Businesses, people can sponsor part of an event. Say it's a First Friday event, and all of the sponsors, of course, get credit for sponsoring. What are they supposed to do if a political candidate chooses to sponsor something? Which are they then, of course, obligated to publicize who their sponsors are, but then they look like they're supporting a particular candidate. What rules, what guides them in how they collect sponsorships from potential candidates?
Well, you could have a policy where you're just not going to do it because appearances are critical, and I have seen community fights break out over that sort of thing. In terms of what does the IRS specifically say about that, I would go to the irs.gov webpage, and they have numerous examples that they outline. You can talk to your lawyer. The worst thing that happens is you lose your tax exempt status if you do it the wrong way, which I think is a fairly stiff penalty. So again, it's intended to assure the community that, you know, a 501c3 is not a political organization. And so I don't have the, you know, here's the bottom line rule and what the law says. I can tell you that if I were on a board, I would just want to have a policy where that doesn't happen.
Great. Thank you. Another question. If an organization votes to make changes to their bylaws, do they need to notify anyone, the IRS, the Attorney General's office, Secretary of State, about those changes?
So currently, no, assuming you haven't changed the purposes of your organization. So when you incorporate, you have to explain what the purpose of your organization is. The same thing when you apply for your tax exempt status. So sometimes we have organizations that have within their name and original purpose very narrowly defined their geographic area that they serve, for instance, where they might provide reading assistance to residents of Columbus. And they have evaluated that, you know, frankly, Columbus is a bit too restrictive in describing who they serve. It's really the Central Ohio area, which is much broader. Then you should make those changes in documents with all three of those organizations.
All three organizations. Okay.
Yes.
Great. Okay. Do we have any other questions coming in? This is a great opportunity to get answers. I know our Main Street directors had a lot of questions going around last month. Beth, can you address the definition of an ex officio board member, whether they are voting or non-voting?
It's always easiest to define. So many people think if you're ex officio, you can't vote. Well, you need to have that term defined in how you intend it to apply, just so it clarifies any questions. So if you intend to have ex officio members who might be former presidents of your organization, and you just want them to be, you know, advisory in nature, then explain that in your bylaws. It doesn't necessarily mean that they can't vote, though. So you said you get to tell what you think should apply. It doesn't mean that they don't vote. It's by nature of their office, their position is how we apply the meaning of ex officio.
Okay, and each organization gets to define that. So for instance, for people out there, Heritage Ohio has ex officio members that vote, and we have ex officio members who do not vote, and those are spelled out exactly in our bylaws and why.
Very good. Sounds like you're doing it right. You know, sunshine, clarity, it prevents a whole lot of questions and struggles from coming up, you know, in the future. So the more that you can make it clear to people what you are doing, it just eliminates a whole lot of questions.
Yeah. So again, a lot of our Main Street communities may have a city council or a mayor on their board because they're so intimately involved in the city. In Heritage Ohio's case, we get money from the Department of Development. So that person has a seat on our board, but they are ex officio non-voting. So we have another question came up. If you raise more money in a campaign than it is needed to do what you wanted to do with the money, what happens to the additional funds?
So great question. So suppose we raise funds for the bleachers and it ended up coming in a lot under budget. It's always helpful if you say in your fundraising materials, any excess funds will just go right into our operating funds.
And another thing is to make sure your budget for the bleachers includes the administrative portion of your organization's efforts towards that. And that's a way you can build your budget out of what qualifies as being part of the bleacher project.
Yes.
And a lot of people don't do that. They only think of what they're paying the contractor, not the 12 months of work that went into it. Another question, is a local organization which raises money required to be filed in Ohio if they're part of a national organization?
That depends. So groups that have affiliate memberships like that can decide to do their reporting and governance in a number of ways. So it's what we call a group exemption. And if the parent organization incorporates information from all of the local subsidiary groups, then they don't have to file a separate report. However, it's most common that each of the local groups will have to file their own because it's not all reported up into a consolidated report from the parent. And if people have questions about that, give our office a call and our compliance examiners can talk through all of that with you and help arrive at the right answer.
Okay, we'll wait for the shy people to write a few questions in. This is a great opportunity.
And I'm going to have to go home and take a closer look at 1702 because I don't think I've ever had so many 1702 questions. And Joyce, if I can add in, if any of you would be interested in hosting a board governance training, because again, this information applies to churches, temples, synagogues, mosques. It applies to PTOs and booster groups. It applies to the Red Cross, the Cancer Society. If you want to host a training in your community, I would love to get out and come see your downtown. So drop me an email and we will, within reason. I can't go to Ashtabula County 74 different times to just do single trainings with single boards. But if you're willing to convene some people, I'd be happy to come out and drop me an email and we'll set something up.
Okay, well, I don't see any other questions coming in yet. Again, if you can see over in the handouts in your control panel, you can download this PowerPoint. It will be on YouTube tomorrow. You will get an email with a link to this so you can share it with your peers, your other board members in the community. Watch for Heritage Ohio's next webinar coming to you in May. You can always find out about details in our events by visiting our website at heritageohio.org. I want to thank Beth so much for giving us this overview. And Heritage Ohio, Francis Joe Hamilton spends a lot of time with board training for Main Street, very specific Main Street board training about additional responsibilities that we expect for being successful. And I want to thank all of you for joining today. Thank you and good afternoon.